Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to Front Porch Philosophers Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by Michael Granado.
Hey, hey.
And Raymond Perrier.
What's up?
There's a long delay, Raymond.
I'm sorry. Is it a long delay? It could be. Is it still a long delay?
All right. It's always a long delay.
Okay.
Are you suggesting that it's the technology and that you're just not paying attention? Because I think it's that you're just not paying attention, right?
It could just be internet.
Just blame it on the
yeah, always blame it on the technology. Faulty technology.
I think it's
Always blame it on
because
technology.
Raymond and I are both living in the deep, dirty South, and so we're not really up to date on our internet connection technology.
So this would be much easier if we were all in the same room, but currently we're in 3 different time zones having this conversation, so that makes everything way more interesting. Anyway, so today's topic, we're going to talk about free will versus determinism. Now, we're not going to speak today, I think, unless the conversation just drifts that way. Our idea at the outset, at least, is to separate this from something like political freedom. So we'll devote a different episode to discussions about political freedom. Freedom in this context, free will versus determinism, comes down to like range of options. And to what extent can we say that we're actually free? For example, if most of the things about ourselves are, from our very elementary particles all the way up to, the situations of our birth have largely been determined for us, right? So to what extent can you actually make free choices? So that's the topic for today. And so I'm going to kick the can over to Raymond to try to flesh out this idea a little bit more, and then we'll get the conversation rolling. So, Raymond.
Awesome. So, free will and determinism, I just want to say that we did the and or as opposed to, or the both and as opposed to either or, because these aren't necessarily conflicting terms, at least not according to some people. But in certain circumstances, they definitely are. So, a couple of thoughts on free will. It's not a I think, and you guys can correct me if you guys think it's wrong, but I think that it's not a huge topic anymore. Thank you. And at least not as big as it used to be. It's become more an intersect, or at least an engagement between neurologists and biologists, people who are studying the brain and trying to decide if there's some material aspect to this thing that we call free will. Most people nowadays, we just talk about will, your desires, your passions, your emotions, and then we kind of treat them as being free from, or free to do certain things because of external circumstances. And that's in large part due to the fact that now, instead of talking about free will, we generally just talk about freedom, which is what we're going to talk about probably like in 2 episodes. I think this is going to be a 2-parter. So, but free will is this idea that we can somehow have a choice, as Jared was saying. And the idea that we have a free will, it presupposes 2 things. One, that we have a will, right? Some sort of faculty in the mind that allows us to is sort of the basis for action, human action. And then 2, that we can somehow be free in this, freely possess or be in total control of this action. So let's ask one simple question. When we talk about free will, what did historically philosophers generally think we were freeing ourselves from? And one of the first things is this idea that humans are, you know horrible creatures. In the religious traditions, they would call it sin, freeing yourself from sin by the grace of God. In the more early modern, philosophies that are starting to move towards what we now think of as science and philosophy science, it's freeing ourselves from our sort of nasty and brutish natures, as Thomas Hobbes talked about it. So in those two capacities, that is generally speaking how the conversation of free will came to light. You was always freeing it from something. So insofar as you had a choice, it was really not whether or not you had a choice of what's called equipoise, which is a choice between two equally weighted options, which is generally speaking uh, not accepted as a logical possibility, but a choice in the sense that you could choose to do something that you thought was better or good, and not just follow the inclinations of what it means to be human. So, and that
Yeah,
takes on a
I think that's
yeah. Go ahead.
oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I've explained a lot, so go ahead and let's start passing the ball around.
No, I think the distinction you made there is really important, and I think is probably indicative of why this isn't necessarily a hot topic anymore, aside from in philosophy. But I think that this entire discussion of free will versus determinism, it has historically speaking, it comes from a religious context,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. I think so.
So specifically, a Christian context, even more specific, I think it arose from the theological question over the nature of salvation.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Do we as people choose our own salvation, or is our salvation sort of predetermined by God, preordained, foreordained
Yeah.
by God?
Yeah.
And salvation in Christian tradition, basically, if you boil it down to its roots, what we're asking is who gets into heaven and who goes to hell.
Yeah.
And so this is this question has a long history to it. Even if you go all the way back to the early church fathers like St. Augustine, they're debating this issue.
Yeah.
So I think it might make sense to start off talking about it in its theological context, and then maybe move forward from there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, I want to add a caveat to that, and this is more or less just posing this as a question. I don't know if you guys would agree. Wouldn't you see something similar? Obviously, not the same thing, but something similar going on with Aristotle's conception of man as a political animal, right, or as a rational animal, such that he makes this distinction in terms of the animal kingdom that human beings are animals, but they're animals of a peculiar kind, animals with a higher capacity for reason. And so that's not to say or suggest that human beings always act rationally, but that human beings have a unique capacity for reason, and that therefore, since that's the thing which defines us from the rest of the animal kingdom for someone like Aristotle, that we're acting most humane, right? We're acting most human when we're being governed by reason. And so I don't know that that is entirely different from the religious context. I think a similar modality of thought is going on
Yeah.
there, though.
Yeah. I and let me.
Yeah.
I was just gonna let me push back a little on
Go
that,
ahead.
because I do think that you're right that that it is definitely strongly rooted in the Greco-Roman philosophical traditions. But I know that you can certainly say that as far as the point that which at which history gets to Augustine, the idea of freedom becomes relocated into the sort of spirit of being human in a more anthropological way than it was previously. And if anything, the current state of affairs that we have right now of talking about freedom as a social or political movement is probably more in touch with the Greco-Roman context than even those Christian cultures that were so closely related to them.
Well, apart from Aristotle, it may actually, now that I think about it, may actually be closer this Christian idea, especially if we're going to locate this in someone like Augustine, then the Christian concept may be much closer to the Platonic notion, right? So Plato's idea of a kind of a two-tier reality, right? That we're living in this world, but the world of the forms or the ideas, the ideal world, is what this present world is kind of a shadow and type of, and that we're kind of progressing towards or trying to reach somehow the ideal world. This obviously had heavy influence on a certain kind of Christianity, particularly the kind of Christianity which you find in Augustine. And so I'm not sure that you can really decouple those two ideas, but that seems to be playing with the same notions,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
That we're trying to free ourselves to find
Yes. Yeah.
ourselves, right?
Yeah. Well,
That
yes.
we have
Yeah.
kind of this base, that there's something wrong with reality, and that what separates human beings from the rest of reality is our higher ability to choose our fate, as it were, right? So a dog chases a car not because it's reasoned that that's the best thing that it can do, but just because that's what nature has dictated for the dog. Or at least this is the frame of thought, right? And so what a person may want to question is, are human beings different from that? Are human beings just acting on instinct? Or do human beings have some ability to reason? Or you could just as well say, well, how do we know that the dog hasn't actually made that decision? These are kind of all the ideas we're playing with. Is everything in the universe, was it set in stone at time zero of the Big Bang, right? And that now we're just kind of playing out the eventualities of all things? Or does nature leave some room for agency? And to what extent can we act on our agency? Or is it all just determined by genetics, by social factors? There's all of these things that you kind of have to settle.
Yeah, let's can we like categorize this, because I feel like this question has evolved over time, and I feel like the parameters of discussion have changed over time, because I mean, we could talk about like historical determinism, and then I think within a contemporary setting, I think we're having a slightly different conversation. So if we could talk about it within the religious context first, and then maybe move into modernity, if that move kind of maybe that's
There's a,
just the
no. There's
historian in
a
me coming out,
there's a good
but
transition there that I can work with, and I think the big thing here to remember is that free will is oftentimes, like you were saying, Michael, and what Jared was hinting at, is some sort of reaction to the understanding of humans, like the state of humanity. And that, insofar as it's religious, in the Christian context, the Western context, is oftentimes tied to this idea of the fallen humanity, the fall from
yeah,
grace, right? That we're no longer in the Garden of Eden, so to speak. That goes, as far back as Augustine, and it carries on throughout to Martin Luther in the Reformation period. And the salvation then is not a question. And this is an interesting point, because Jared was talking about the association of free will to reason, which is in some sense more rooted in a modern to postmodern scenario, because definitely with the certain sections of Christianity that you have to deal with theologically, the fall of man would include the fall of reason as well. So then there is no active human um, of humanity that can save itself, barring the grace of God, right? So that kind of thing. So that's an important distinction. And then the transition, I think, when it becomes early modern, is when we start seeing the idea of fallen state of affairs, of being human, becomes reimagined as sort of a negative portrayal of what it means to be man, insofar as it's associated with animals and beast, right? So instead of
uh-uh,
identifying us as gentle bunnies, we look like brutish bears that tear through everything and kill, right? That kind of thing. So the brutish nature of humanity becomes taken up into natural philosophy in the early modern period. But I do think it stems from this idea of a fallen state of creation, and the Western religion.
yeah. And to
If we
be
could pit this in,
Go ahead, Jared.
Go ahead, Mike. Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, if we wanted to characterize this in terms of some thinkers, so this just kind of puts some names up on the board to help people think through this. This is more heuristic than anything else.
Yeah.
So if you see the distinction between the philosophies of someone like Pelagius versus St. Augustine, so this was a debate in early Christianity. Pelagius thought that basically human nature was redeemable, right? That there was something, on the whole, human beings are good, right? We make mistakes, but basically human beings are all right, and that God is there to kind of mold us and help us to do better. Whereas Augustine thought that human beings were utterly irredeemable, that we were so fundamentally flawed that we were in need of a savior, as it were, that we could not be what we needed to be in order to attain salvation. We can never do it on our own because human beings are basically trash. Kind of de-theologized, you see this image, this dueling view of human nature reemerge in modernity, I think, between Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Rousseau famously talked about, man, and he talked about I'm losing the words that he used in terms of he talked about like a noble savage, which is a really condescending idea.
But it's a pretty popular idea throughout early modern writers. They'll toss that term around quite a bit.
Yeah. So basically, Rousseau thought that human beings left to their own devices were pretty okay, and that basically society and the machinations of the modern world were what corrupted human beings, right? So if we could ever just get back to this kind of simple anarchism, then human nature would redeem itself in this way. Whereas Thomas Hobbes famously developed this idea of a social contract insofar as human beings need society to keep us from destroying each other, because at base we're, beastly, and that we'll kill and take unless there's something there to stop us. So in a very simplistic way, you see this in kind of a religious context between Augustine and Pelagius, and they use characteristically Christian language. But if you fast forward to the modern age, you see this same kind of dichotomy between views of human nature in de-theologized language with discussions of Hobbes and Rousseau.
I'd add Locke to the list as well. Locke basically echoing Rousseau. I mean, same position in terms of the political philosophy. And I also wanted to add real quick, because we are talking about this within a historical context, but this is a theological debate that is still very much debated amongst people who believe this stuff.
That's the last stronghold of it in our current century.
Yeah, and you can see this divide in Protestant churches between certain denominations that favor a more free will approach. I think perhaps most famously would be the Methodist Church.
Amen.
Following
John
Arminius.
Wesley. Mm-hmm. And as opposed to certain denominations that take a hardline deterministic approach, perhaps best seen in what would you say, Presbyterianism?
A certain kind of Presbyterianism, yeah. There's
the Calvinist followers.
Well, you have Calvinism, and the Presbyterians are a form of Calvinism, and then within mainline Presbyterianism in the United States is pretty relaxed on this stuff these days. It's one of these progressive mainline churches, right? But they're still kind of old school Presbyterians that are so-called hyper Calvinists, right? Double predestination type, that essentially, for those who aren't familiar with it, this idea of double predestination comes down to Calvin more or less taught.
John Calvin,
the second generation Protestant reformer.
Yeah. Wrong Calvin. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's where he got the name, right? Calvin and Hobbes. That's he got the names from Thomas Hobbes and John Calvin.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Shout out to Thomas Hobbes fans. Anyway, Thomas and Hobbes and Calvin fans.
Calvin and Hobbes.
I'm good. You're just screwing it.
Now we're getting confused.
Yeah. Well, I think we started confused. But
yeah.
It's fine. Anyway, so John Calvin, this gets back to one of those debates where we talked about kind of traditional attributes of the divine. They can kind of hem you into weird positions, right? So if you believe that God is all powerful and all knowing, right? So if God has all knowledge, then does that mean that God knows the future, right? So this is a problem that you encounter if you affirm that idea in kind of a simplistic way. So if you say God knows everything, that means that God has to know the future. Well, in a traditional idea about the afterlife, right, that there's a heaven and hell, then this means for someone like John Calvin that God had to have determined at the outset of all things who was going to heaven and who was going to hell, right? And that he can do this through his inscrutable will, because anything that God does is ipso facto perfect. So there's no moral dilemma in God kind of deciding that some people go to heaven, some people go to hell in a rather arbitrary sense. Now, his kind of double predestination would have been opposed by people like Luther, for example. But you can see, I don't want to say the appeal of it, but you can see the rationale behind it, right?
It's much more.
It's certainly. I hope you don't see the appeal
It's
of
more
it.
defensible in just like basic argumentative terms, because free will is a very difficult concept to nail down and explain or even demonstrate, right? But let's hover here for a moment and talk about this, because I think one of the major turns in the free will debate is on moral grounds, and that is to say that you cannot
Okay.
speak about, a just, worthy God, or a just, worthy set, set of life, without talking about the possibility of free will. If there is no possibility of making a choice to do good or making the choice to do bad, then the idea of justice becomes a very different kind of term than what we would normally think about, which is the ability to hold people accountable, treat them as culpable for their actions, and do what courts do, which is punish people, imprison them, whatever. So we should hover here and
Yeah.
talk a little bit about
Well,
it.
to frame it another way, in case you didn't follow that, was essentially to say that if people have no control over what they do, then what right does society have to punish them?
Precisely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so in discussions about, psychology, like Psych 101, right? This is early stuff. You encounter this debate in terms of nature versus
Oh
nurture,
man, you
like
stole
who's
my thunder.
ultimately responsible. Sorry, man.
I
Sorry.
think.
I'll
Anyway, go
I'll
ahead.
let
Continue
you
with your
fill
point.
that out.
Okay.
No. I was gonna say I'll let you fill that out, but this is basically where this starts to intersect with other disciplines. Is people talk about where does responsibility ultimately lie in terms of actions? Is it just a person's responsibility, or were they kind of shaped and molded by their society? And if people don't have any actual controls, right? If they were determined by their social settings, then how fair is it to punish them? Go ahead, Mike.
Oh well. Yeah. I don't know if we exactly want to get into this right now, but yeah. I
Oh, I
mean,
want to get into it.
this is kind of, and I think we said this toward the beginning of the podcast, but this entire debate surrounding free will versus determinism, like I said that it had theological grounding, but ever since modernity, ever since 14th, 15th century, this debate dovetails and takes a whole bunch of different forms, impacting a whole bunch of different areas of study. And one area in which the debate is alive and well in a different form, I would argue, is that within modern psychology, which really doesn't develop until the 20th century. Sorry, everybody before then, i.e., Freud. But I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I don't have a background in psychology. I can't say stuff like
You
that.
can say whatever
But
you want, man.
within modern
This is a safe
psychology,
space, Michael.
yeah, that's right. It's my podcast, our podcast. But you have the free will versus determinism debate kind of reformulated. If you take an intro to psych class, if you take a developmental psychology class, especially, you'll hear this debate over nature versus nurture, what Jared mentioned. And basically, this is a debate over how impacted are we by our genes. For example, it's a it's a false dichotomy, but you have to understand the dichotomy to understand the problem. So you have nature, which is the argument that says that we as people are shaped and formed by our genetic makeup, that who you are, from your how you identify yourself, to your sexual orientation, to the types of food that you prefer, to whatever, that all of that has been somehow determined by your gene set. Versus nurture, which would say that those qualities of yourself are determined by basically how you were raised, so to speak. So you hear this distinction, but within modern psychology, I mean, it's kind of a 50-50, and it's not really like a one or the other. That's why I called it a false dichotomy. But I want to get back and I want to ask Raymond a question. So beginning with this, we've talked free will versus determinism. How exactly did these concepts change during modernity?
Yeah, so there are a number of things um, that spurned it, and I think that it's good that we brought up this aspect of psychology because it definitely takes a cue, a page out of this book. But I think that the idea stemming from Galileo, from Descartes, from Newton, that we could somehow come up with these laws of nature, and this discussion about the logic of cause and effect, which took
Yeah,
on different forms as much as in physics as it did in cosmology, and cosmotheological ideas of where is the origin of the universe, the origin of man. These questions started becoming interesting, and in insofar as that was the case, um, you start seeing the development of this idea of determinism, because in truth, you had
yeah,
it in the sense of a fall of humanity in previous contexts, but they didn't speak about it in terms of deterministic principles of nature. That wasn't how they talked about it.
right.
It was thought of as the fall of humanity, so it was more or less associated with a value concept like evil or bad. This is what happens when we fall from grace and are no longer in that direct relationship with the divine. And so that still permeates. You have the occasionalist theologians like Nicholas Malebranche, who is
Yes.
sort of wrapping new ideas about causality and the laws of nature in with his cosmological understanding of God. You have works, Clark, right? Isn't that his name? Against Newton, that's doing
Yeah,
cosmology,
Samuel.
and then you have these.
Well, Clark and Newton are writing together.
Okay, writing together, and then you
Yeah,
have these ideas of fatalism that comes from different religious contexts, where basically people are under the impression that whatever happens to them is the way that God planned things. So whether it's horrific events, or whether it's this disease or that sickness, this is what God intended, even if it was arguably their own fault or their own actions that brought them to this position. And then alongside of this, you have natural philosophy, who's also saying there are these causal relationships in the world, a causal nexus, if you will, of just web of cause and effect, that
hmm,
if you map out and you explain, then you can on a microscopic level and on a very fundamental level determine where every action comes from. And this gets taken into
yes,
anthropology to a certain extent, philosophical anthropology, not modern anthropology, insofar as we start talking about the emotions or the instincts, the basic sort of drivers of being human. And the need for food pushes us to find food and sustain ourselves. The need for this pushes us this direction, the need for that pushes us this direction. And when you start bringing all of these
yeah,
actions and these decisions back down to the basic instincts and the basic needs of being human, then you start to question whether or not there is a choice in anything, and whether or not this is just coming from baser instincts. And then when we get to more modern questions about nature versus nurture, we start thinking about the environmental, the social, the cultural, the political impacts how we get forced to do
Yes.
things because of these outside external forces. So that's a good distinction there, internal versus internal. Um,
Yeah, I like that. I liked how you summarized that there because in my mind, I like to sort of create a couple of different categories for this and kind of separate them to talk, to understand that we're talking about different things. Because, like Raymond, like you were saying, describing the rise of early modern science, for example, you have physical determinism that is sort of assumed within uh, Newtonian mechanics, for example, which assumes that the universe is going to behave and has behaved according to certain laws. And once you start making these assumptions, you start to get this deterministic position within physics, in which the life of the universe, the cycle of the universe, so to speak, is predetermined because it abides by these certain laws. Or, to use the language of the early modern scientists, because God had somehow endowed the universe with these laws. And slowly, it seems like over time, at least in my mind, this physical determinism starts to get applied to social areas, right? So you start to get like historical determinism with writers such as Hegel and Marx. The idea that human situations are determined in the same way that the universe is determined, that there's a definite outcome to history, there's a definite outcome to human action. And then, of course, you get the same sort of debate as we already talked about, a similar debate within modern psychology over nature versus nurture.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
absolutely.
Would
It's
you agree with that?
Newtonian physics is extremely easy to demonstrate, very clear, very logical. And so it's only natural that other disciplines would see this and be like, how can I apply these laws to understand my own, subject matter better? It happens all the time. I think it's a very natural development, and given that it was so provable in the way that it was, it's I would have done the same damn thing if I was smart enough back then. I mean, yeah, just rip off
Right?
Newton and keep working in these other fields to talk about it, right?
Yeah. Everyone wanted the same success that he had.
Yeah. Well, and it just
Can I ask?
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I have a tangential question, so finish your
I was
thought.
just going to say that
Some
This is just a
bullshit
point of
question.
clarity.
that the interesting thing about this debate is that as determinism becomes a more viable theory, the idea of a free will is becomes challenged and it's under attack to some degree, and there are a lot of thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes and Hobbes and Leibniz who are having this intricate debate at this time about the stakes here. And but what's interesting is that determinism and the way that we just talked about it actually kind of is a grounding historically for the development of this idea of freedom in the modern world, in our world. And it doesn't, it kind of comes in sort of the like post Kantian light of talking about freedom without being overly concerned about the idea of a free will in the way that they used to think of it. So, um, yeah, it's interesting that that's kind of where it came from. But that's just to say that this does connect to a concept of freedom in another episode.
I was going to ask a point of clarity. So you had mentioned the occasionalism of Malebranche, and I don't know to what extent this is influenced perhaps by someone like Al-Ghazali. Are you familiar at all with what I'm mentioning there?
Yeah, yeah,
So, like in Islamic philosophy, you have someone like Al-Ashari and Al-Ghazali were famous for an occasionalist view, taking an occasionalist view because of these problems, right? So they explicitly rejected the Aristotelianism of someone like Avicenna, for example, and someone later on would be like Ibn Rushd or Averroes, as he's known in the West. These are people that abided by an Aristotelian view of the universe, which is largely seen as deterministic. And so this didn't seem to cede enough ground to the divine in terms of absolute freedom. And so you have an occasionalist view which emerges in Islamic philosophy with Al-Ashari and then is promulgated by Al-Ghazali. And this may not be historically correct. I don't know how influenced Malebranche was by someone like Al-Ghazali, even though Al-Ghazali was writing first. But it's a
Yeah.
similar response, right? This idea that you're opening up room for divine freedom if you don't have a deterministic universe. So basically, the universe doesn't. It looks regulatory, like it looks like it abides by certain rules, but ultimately, this is just God kind of keeping things going.
Yeah. And that takes different forms. There are more hardcore occasionalist theories that would make you think that every time you decide you need to go to the bathroom, God's the one who's doing this. So it has this really undignified connection to human behavior that is also connected to God. But just to be clear, occasionalism is basically this idea that God is the only cause of motion and activity in the world. And any substance, whether it's an animate or an inanimate, whether it's, a living animal, a human, or a rock, doesn't have any power to be the ground of its own efficient causes. So basically, God is the first and absolute cause of all necessary effects that unfold in the world. And then there's these additional ideas of God conserving creation or constantly creating, like recreating things every moment. And you don't necessarily have to be an occasionalist to think in terms of conservation theology, which is just that God is connected to the world in a way that conserves it. But there are these very extreme forms of occasionalism, which Malebranche was. I can't speak to his historical connection directly, but at that time period, there were definitely more interactions with the Islamic community, though usually they were negative engagements. They didn't think very highly of many of them, of the scholars they read.
Well, this
Can I ask Raymond a question now?
it seems like this is going to
Unless you
be
had a.
no. My only follow up on this was just during the medieval period. This was an enormous problem, right? So this is something that many of the medieval thinkers, whether it was in the Christian East in Byzantium, whether it was in the Islamic world, whether it was in the Jewish context, or whether it was in the Latin Christian context, writers from Boethius up through like Erugena and a lot of these different thinkers, Thomas Aquinas, all these people were attempted to discuss how one could reconcile this apparent problem of God's foreknowledge, the apparent deterministic nature of the universe, along with free agency and human beings' ability to make choices in the world which were morally meaningful, right, and existentially meaningful. This was a huge problem, and people had many different answers to it. Anyway, just that was another historical thing. So,
No, that's a really good point because we don't talk much about medieval philosophy.
yeah, try getting it in it wherever I can.
Yeah. A lot of really interesting shit happened in the Middle Ages. Yeah. So Raymond, let me this is kind of backtracking a little bit, but you mentioned the change. So you mentioned Kant, right? And Kant, for those of you who don't know, absolutely pivotal figure,
Immanuel
not
Kant.
only in 19th century philosophy, Immanuel Kant, but in philosophy, period. If you take a philosophy class, you don't talk about Kant, sue the university and get your money back. But so Raymond, you talked about the notion of post-Kantian free will. You talked about how after Kant, this notion of free will or freedom of the will sort of merges with the idea of freedom. Saving our discussion of freedom till later, I was wondering if you could talk about what caused that transition, how that transition happened, or why it happened.
Yeah, I mean, so he's supposed to be a break between the moderns and the postmoderns, but I think it's more fair and more comprehensive to say that he's more of a bridge. You really start to see in Leibniz and these early figures this idea that yes, that we have this thing called a will, right? This is the basis of human action, which is in itself a problematic way of talking about things. When you start talking about neurology and biology and stuff, you have to think about it in different terms. But at that time, the faculties of the will of the mind were intellect, will, passions, things like that. They were just kind of the list of things that we could describe ourselves as the most fundamental categories of human being. And Kant on one hand, believed that we are a creature that competes between desires and our reason. They're competing in some sense, or they're held together. And in order to be a good person, there has to be, in a sense, a kind of harmony between the universal laws of reason, which would be the moral laws, right? The categorical imperatives, and then, which that's not important right now, so don't
We'll come
think
back
too much
to
on
it.
that. And then
Yeah.
the yeah, and then the ideas that we are subject to basic needs, right? Very, very practical examples of, if you're a father or a mother of two children, and you're in a certain circumstance where you have to feed them, but you can't get enough food for everybody, then you starve yourself to feed your kids, right? And so these are decisions we choose based off necessity, but these are also decisions that are moral. And so for Kant, the question wasn't so much about whether or not we could free ourselves from our baser instincts. This was the early modern question and the sort of traditional religious question. It was really a question of whether or not there was this idea of an unconditioned action, whether or not there was ever a point where your human action was in itself an original starting place, an original creation or an original event to yourself or to itself, and not spurned or conditioned by some other force, whether it be natural needs of desires, whether it be external forces, like politics, religion, social constructs, anything like that. And that's a very different take on the understanding of the will, which isn't necessarily he never talked about it in terms of a free will, at least not frequently. And so this idea of a unconditioned will, which the will is still very important, is more aligned with this idea of human freedom, which is the ability to essentially make a decision in and of yourself without some other condition compelling you to do so. And this is an interesting a turn. This isn't the he's not the first one to say this, but he doesn't really use the word free will. He uses the word, unconditioned or conditioned, and that's his whole debate. Actually, he uses the phrase transcendental freedom, but I really don't want to try and explain transcendental on the podcast because it just takes us into the lecture hall. And so I'd rather just conditioned and
Yeah.
unconditioned. I think everybody can agree that we know what that means. That there are conditions that drive your life, right? Oh my
I have
god,
no idea what that
Jared.
means.
No, well, yeah, Jared,
Here,
you take it.
let me ask a question relative to this. Well, how do we square now? At the time in which Kant was writing, late 18th, early 19th, cusp of the 19th century, you know, I think here is where we can talk about the genuine impact at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, of someone like Freud in this terms of this conversation, because the thing that Freud, I mean, despite all of his weird theories, the one that has become so we've more or less all bought into this idea of Freud that we don't even really think of it that much is that we don't think about consciousness in the same way post Freud, because we recognize that human beings have all of these latent desires, all these unspoken drives, and these may not even be conscious to ourselves. And I think that for a lot of modern readers of Kant, they see his conception of an unconditioned moral responsibility as not naive but antiquated post Freud, because what Freud's contribution was to say, well, look, our desires may not even be conscious to ourselves. We may not even realize how conditioned we are by society, by our, hidden and suppressed desires, by the conditions of our animality, and how would I don't think that you necessarily have to go to bat for Kant here, but what do you think the response from a modern Kantian would be to that problem? Or do you even think that's relevant? Just tossing that out there.
Yeah, no, I mean this, as you all should know, because you were taught by the same gentleman that I'm going to speak of right here. David S. Pacini has already made this argument that, shout
Shout
out
out
to
to
Pacini,
Pacini.
Shout out.
that Freud and Kant.
Just side note, there's no way that Pacini is listening to this. So
No.
yeah.
And if he knew we were involved, even more so, right?
Even more so, he
Yeah.
would be like, "This is just utter nonsense."
Garbage.
So I'm glad to bring his name into this conversation because I know he'd probably disapprove.
Let's associate him with us immediately.
No, he would think it was funny. He wouldn't disapprove. He would just think it was funny. But but the argument has already been made that Kant understood that the biggest problem with moral laws and morality was that we could never, as human beings, be absolutely certain of our incentives. We're never absolutely certain that the reason we think we're doing something is actually the reason that we're doing it, and that upon further reflection or upon an objective observation by somebody like a friend, or if you've done something stupid or wrong, you
Not
begin to
necessarily.
realize that your incentive for doing something, not
All right.
necessarily. Not, okay, all right. Let's.
I've been arrested way
Not
too many times for
necessarily, right?
that.
There's
I'm just.
so many good stories about those too.
I'm
Not to
just saying,
derail
an
the
objective,
conversation.
some other observer would make you question, would just make you question whether or not your incentives were what you thought they were.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Well,
But this gets
I think a
into the
better
whole
example.
premise of the
Can
psychoanalytic.
I interject a better example? Speaking of psychoanalytic,
Yes, since you have heard of Porch so much.
I think a better example would be if and when you ever go to therapy, you quickly realize that most of your actions are the result of things that you had no idea was even on your plate at the moment. You realize, oh yeah, I act like this because my father left me as a child. Not to get too personal, but that sort of reasoning.
And not even something that deep, just something that could be very on the surface, like, no, you did this because of this. It's very obvious, right? It's not like necessarily some major historic event in your life that
Well, I was
could
just
have
going to
been
say it doesn't have to be an either or thing, like where you say, well, I thought I was doing it for this reason, but it turns out it's this other reason. It can be both and. So, for example, let's say you're the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and you you hate your rival Hegel. Maybe it's because you think he's a hack. I would say maybe it's because you think he's a hack, but you're also
for good reason.
You genuinely think he's a hack, and he doesn't understand Kant. But also, it's because no one comes to your lectures because they're all going to hang out with Hegel. So don't be so thirsty. Don't be so thirsty, Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
Arthur Schopenhauer, really great, another great philosopher, by the way.
Anyways, yeah. So that's definitely, and that's definitely something that people have talked about with Kant, and but anyway, so let's get back to the crutch of this, because we're getting to the end of our discussion here. Try and lead us into something in part 2 of this. We still need to. We've kind of laid out the history. We've kind of laid out the distinctions, and I want to get to what we want to discuss as sort of the basic and fundamental question here. Is it worth talking about free will anymore? Is it worth talking about a will anymore? Or is it, one of these things where we've historically sort of arrived at this purpose of this understanding of determinism, where it just makes it untenable, and that I kind of want to see how this debate hashes out amongst the three of us.
Oh, who wants to go first?
Well, we can't do it all. Let's just start with answering some of those questions. Or where do we fall? Do you think that we could still discuss and sort of defend free will, or is determinism the way? Or is there some sort of, like today now we talk about compatibilist theories of free will and determinism, which is a whole thing we didn't even discuss, but that could come up in the next one with this whole debate. So go ahead, Jared, you start.
Well, I see this in pragmatic terms, right? So I'm going to defend Kant in this respect. So Kant's ideas about God and his ideas about freedom were that these things are fundamentally unprovable, but these are practical postulates of reason, which basically means that they're really useful concepts. They can be defended, and while you can't know one way or the other, if you were to reject those notions, it creates a shit ton of other problems, right? So it's kind of like debating the external world, right? So Husserl gets to this later on, which is to say, we can't know if there's an external world. We just have to kind of bracket it. We have to bracket it out and assume that there is, because
Yes, we can.
your goal in every conversation is just to derail it, isn't it? Anyway, so things like
Go ahead with your BS.
thank you. Things like an absolute notion of truth, the idea of God, the idea of freedom, the idea of an external world. I see these as useful concepts, and whether we can ever definitively prove them is that's less relevant to me than just saying that we have to kind of assume to certain degrees. If we're going to talk meaningfully about things like morality, you kind of have to assume that there's agency in the world. And if you say, well, there's not, then you kind of have to fall silent then on issues like morality. And very few people are willing to do that, so we're kind of stuck, I think, with a compatibilist notion. We recognize that there are certainly things within the universe which seem determined, right? But that we seem to have some sort of limited agency. We're not absolutely free, right? Because absolute freedom doesn't belong to finite creatures. It doesn't belong to things which are contingent in nature. But you can have a limited range of freedoms.
Okay.
That's all I was going to say.
Okay.
I would,
Mike, because
okay.
I'm writing all this down
Is it my turn?
so I can bring it up in the next episode and make you defend yourself.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Okay. Well, I would like to talk about different types of determinism that we haven't touched on yet that I think are relevant to some conversations, to some areas of philosophy. Next episode, if we can get into talk about I would say like the question of determinism is a legitimate question in terms of modern day physics, but also within the philosophy of technology, for example. Technological determinism, I think, is a real conversation that we need to be having. Now, to your question, Raymond, about the will and free will, to me, both of those terms are just kind of have gone the way of the dinosaur. And I just think that there's better ways of, yeah, I just think that there's better ways of talking about this stuff. Like, I don't really see a point in using 18th century terminology such as the will when we have modern psychology. You know, I don't understand that. Or talking about freedom of the will. Likewise, I mean, I think we could talk about the concept of freedom, absolutely, and I think we could talk about the concept of freedom within ethics and freedom within politics. I think all those are meaningful discussions, but to try to bring back notions of the will, I just think we're kind of beyond that now.
He said in the last couple of minutes of our discussion.
Right? I mean, historically, absolutely, we have to. These are like pivotal ideas within Western thought. Like, you have to talk about it. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Round us out,
Okay.
Raymond.
Well, I'm gonna take that torch and defend free will then. And I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it indirectly as you explain your positions. I'm going to point out the reason why free will was such a huge issue for some of these thinkers, and see if we can uh, be a little less harsh to just throw it out altogether as being no longer useful. Um, and I'm not, and
Trash
just
it. It's
to your
garbage.
point,
Michael, for
Jared,
those
I'm
of
not.
us who are listening, Michael is making throwing motions. You can't get that without the video, so it's just for you.
No, you can't. I guess that doesn't make much sense.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So we'll touch on all that next time, I think, and and I'll have a list of questions for both of you on your positions, and
Oh
we'll see
God.
if we can hash this out and come to a decision, and hopefully lead us into a question or a discussion about freedom, which I think we can all admit is probably a more acceptable and probably even a stronger concept for talking about this
Yes.
in the long run, which is why nowadays we've sort of settled on that. Greater minds have led us to this conclusion. So,
I think the real question is: are our positions on this predetermined? And if so,
If by predetermined you mean right,
that's what
yes.
I should have done. I should have taken up the torch of the predeterminist.
oh yeah, just for the
the
sake
the,
of
the
argument.
theological determinist. Yeah, just to do it. We may have to have a couple of dialogue episodes where we just like choose a camp and then try our best to defend it until we run out of steam and see what
I'm
happens.
not defending all that metaphysical BS. Why don't we get somebody who actually believes it so I can tell them how stupid they
That
are?
shouldn't be that hard to find. So this will be
That's
our
pretty
man
easy,
on the
actually.
street episode. Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Do you believe in angels?
It won't take us too
Oh
long to
man.
find that. Well, it won't take me too long. It might take Jared a little longer given his location, but me and Michael, I could find 10
Yeah.
people in the next hour if I wanted to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
In the
easily.
deep and dirty South,
Yeah.
I mean they're on every corner.
Out here in Southern California, it would be like, do you believe in, I don't know, like the latest guru?
Mineral water,
No, essential
Mineral
oils.
water.
Do you
healing
believe
crystals.
in the
Essential
healing
oils.
powers of essential oils?
I do.
Y'all had an outbreak of measles recently. You could talk about like anti-vax.
You can say like
or whatever.
like I'm part of the tribe. Or
You're part of it. You're part of the problem.
my kids are vaccinated, so
And I'm pretty sure that wasn't very recent. I think that was like a couple of years ago in Disneyland.
Disneyland had an outbreak of measles. No,
Disneyland.
there was an outbreak of measles recently, but it wasn't in California. I don't remember where it was at, but it was in kind of a hotbed of anti-vaccination stuff.
Idiots.
Yeah,
Yeah. And in defense of California, it's probably like 99.2% vaccinated or higher. I doubt that there's as many people as you would think who are not vaccinated there.
I don't know. I haven't looked at polling numbers. So.
Oh, I pulled that out of my ass, but I'm pretty sure that that's probably a safer bet. It's definitely over 98% for sure.
That's where statistics come from, right? Anytime someone one has a statistic at the ready, and then two, when that statistic involves like 90 or more percent, you can just be certain that is a made up statistic. Because no one just has statistics at the ready. No normal human being.
Everybody who's listening to this should definitely Google that, because I don't know if that's true. But I do think it is
What a weird place to land our
common
discussion.
Sense.
What a weird place to land our discussion on free will and determinism.
But I'm not sure if I want to.
No, don't do it, because this is actually, does the anti-vaxxer have free will? Or were they determined to make this choice?
Yeah. Well, we could definitely have like a medical ethics episode and talk about stuff like that. But
if they themselves were not vaccinated, they wouldn't live long enough to make the decision.
All right, I think we're going off the rails now. I think we're more or less at time. So thank you for joining us again. This is Front Porch Philosophers. We'll see you next time.
Peace.
Peace.